A full investigation. Both the White House and the Vice President weigh in on the gruesome discovery of baby remains at an abortion doctor's home. Final appeal. New details in Cardinal George Pell's fight against his conviction for sexual abuse. High-stakes election. Voting is underway in Israel, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is locked in a very tight race. And an opening prayer. A report from New York on the role Catholics are playing before the start of the United Nations General Assembly. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, September 17th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Mark Irons. The White House wants a full investigation into an abortion house of horrors. The family of abortion doctor George Klopfer, who died earlier this month, discovered he kept more than 2,000 baby remains. A White House spokesman says hoarding their bodies like trophies is a new level of sickness. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi has reaction from lawmakers to this gruesome news. Jason?
Mark, Indiana lawmakers, some of them want to know if there's more baby remains out there behind the closed clinic doors of this abortion doctor. Dr. Ulrich George Klopfer did abortions in Indiana. He lived in Illinois, and so some lawmakers are wondering, did he break the law in bringing baby parts over state lines?
That was appalling to hear that.
Senator Mike Braun represents Indiana, the state where Dr. Klopfer performed thousands of abortions.
I think that's another one of the sad things that occurs when you lean too far in the direction of making abortions that easy.
Vice President Mike Pence was governor of Indiana when the state took away Klopfer's medical license. He tweets, his actions should be fully and thoroughly investigated. Several Indiana state lawmakers also urged the state's Attorney General, Curtis Hill, to investigate. Hill tells us he will, working with the Attorney General of Illinois. Pro-life Hoosiers prayed outside Klopfer's Indiana clinics for decades. Cindy Robertson told us about her friendship with the doctor she called George.
He believed that life began with the first breath after the birth of the child. Every time he said that was his opinion, I would tell him it's not about opinion. He maintained that first breath policy until a few months ago.
Robertson says Klopfer's views started changing.
After George lost his license, he would go over to the Life Center. He would talk with the people there. Sometimes he would even go into the Adoration Chapel and sit. George did not totally convert, as far as I know, but perhaps he did at the end of his life. That is my firm hope.
Indiana's governor is also calling for a federal investigation. We did ask the Department of Justice if they will investigate. We're still waiting for an answer. And pro-life Hoosiers say they want to help bury the remains of these babies. Indiana law does require that aborted babies are either buried or cremated. And back in May, the Supreme Court actually upheld that Indiana law. Mark?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. Coming up later in the show, we'll hear from one of the lawmakers in Indiana calling for an investigation. House Democrats held their first hearing today in what they are calling an impeachment investigation.
The White House has directed not to disclose the substance of any discussions with the president.
The sole witness was former campaign manager for President Trump, Corey Lewandowski. He refused to answer most of the Judiciary Committee's questions. Lewandowski was following White House orders not to discuss confidential conversations with the president beyond what was in public in former counsel Robert Mueller's report. Leaders of Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement made a direct appeal for help to lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Afterward, they held a small rally. Among those testifying was Joshua Wong. He says the stakes have never been higher for the former British territory, and he asked the lawmakers to be on the side of democracy. Hong Kong has seen months of pro-democracy demonstrations. At least 48 people are dead after a pair of suicide bombings in Afghanistan. Roughly 24 were killed in the Afghan capital of Kabul. The blast detonated near the U.S. Embassy. NATO and several local government buildings are also located nearby. The Taliban claimed responsibility for both attacks. Iran's supreme leader says there will not be talks with the United States on any level. Ayatollah Khamenei made the announcement earlier today. There had been speculation of a possible meeting between the U.S. and Tehran at the United Nations later this month. Iran's leader says the U.S. must return to the 2015 nuclear deal before he would consider any negotiations. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu cast his ballot in an unprecedented repeat election in Israel. He is the longest-serving leader in the country's history, but he is facing a possible indictment on corruption charges and is running neck and neck with challenger Benny Gantz, a retired military chief. Exit polls show Netanyahu falling short of securing a majority in parliament. Cardinal George Pell, the most senior member of the Catholic clergy to be found guilty of sexually abusing children, has lodged an appeal to Australia's highest court. The former Vatican finance minister was found guilty in December. An appeals court upheld the ruling last month. The 78-year-old was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He is no longer a member of the Holy Father's Council of Cardinals. Joining us now is Ed Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency and a Canon lawyer. Ed, what can you tell us about this appeal, and what are the chances of the High Court actually hearing it?
Well, so in filing for leave to appeal to the High Court in Australia, Cardinal Pell really is making his last attempt to clear his name. Now, there's no guarantee that his appeal will be taken by the court. The vast majority of appeals to the High Court in Australia are rejected. They really tend to only take those cases which they think are of a special legal significance or national importance. But arguably, Cardinal Pell's case presents both.
And what arguments will his lawyers have to make to try to compel the High Court to get this appeal?
Well, his legal team have made it clear that they're pursuing an appeal on two grounds to the High Court. The first is that the majority of the appeal court judges that upheld his conviction erred when they basically said to dent their confidence in his single accuser, Cardinal Pell would basically have had to demonstrate the impossibility for him to have committed the crime, that he was denied the standard of reasonable doubt, that he was forced to demonstrate either the impossibility of him having done it, and anything less than that meant that the accuser was considered wholly credible. The second ground is that the appeal court erred in saying that he couldn't raise a reasonable doubt about the actual circumstances of time or place. Now, his legal team have argued all the way along the line that the time and place that he is said to have committed these acts of sexual abuse, that is, in a crowded cathedral sacristy after a Sunday Mass, is simply impossible, and it, at the very least, leaves a reasonable doubt.
And those two lower courts found him guilty. If he gets in front of the highest court, what are his actual chances? What can you tell us about the High Court? What's it going to look like?
Well, there's really no way of assessing his actual chances if he gets in front of the High Court. I'd say that really the first and most important barrier is for him to get there in the first place. Now, because there's been so much attention both in Australia and beyond on his case right the way along the way, there's definitely the sufficient attention for the High Court to say this needs a final resolution. At the same time, ever since the appeal court delivered its divided ruling last month, a lot of people have been saying that there are significant questions of justice at play here, that whether or not Pell really did get the chance to raise a reasonable doubt in his own defense is an open question and can have serious repercussions for Australian justice.
Let's look at a headline here. The Associated Press ran a headline today calling Cardinal Pell the most senior Catholic pedophile. Now, several news organizations, including the Washington Post, ran that headline without changes. What do you make of that language, most senior Catholic pedophile?
Well, I mean, I think anyone who takes the judicial system seriously, takes the appellate court system seriously, that's exactly the kind of language that does no one any favors. I think it's also fair to say that a lot of the treatment by the media, both in Australia and abroad, of Cardinal Pell's case from the very beginning has been characterized by exactly this sort of rush to judgment and presumed guilt. A lot of questions were raised during the time of the jury trial, both jury trials, in fact. The first one finished deadlocked in Pell's favor, made much of the fact that with so much media coverage against Cardinal Pell, getting a fair trial in the first place was almost impossible. I mean, we should remember that another Australian archbishop, Archbishop Wilson of Adelaide, was found guilty of obstructing justice and hiding instances of sexual abuse. He was subsequently cleared on appeal, and the judge said that he had basically been convicted on the grounds of media prejudice against the Catholic Church.
Thank you for your continual coverage of this. Ed Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency and a Canon lawyer. Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Bishops from India are in Rome for a visit with the Holy Father. They met with Pope Francis this morning at the Vatican. This is the second group of Indian leaders to meet with the Pope. Other bishops met on Friday. Bishop Sebastianabin Singaroyan from the Diocese of Salem, India, joins us from Rome. Your Excellency, you met with Pope Francis today. What did he tell you and your fellow Indian bishops?
This morning, the meeting with the Holy Father, Pope Francis, was very beautiful, and it was done in a very exceptional way. We were there with the Holy Father for about 2 hours, and there was no formal speech, but the Pope invited us to share our concerns in our missions in the church in the southern part of India. And Holy Father was clarifying and giving his mind and advice to us as bishops how we should be moving about in our mission in South India. It was very friendly meeting and also very encouraging for all of us that most of the concerns we expressed, the Holy Father gave his advice and his opinion about how we should be going in the church. A very beautiful meeting with the Holy Father this day.
And Your Excellency, I want to ask, Hindus and Muslims make up nearly 90% of the Indian population, or 95% of the population. Are you concerned in particular about the rise of Hindu nationalism?
I think the whole world knows today about the rise of Hindu nationalism in India, and it is very much having the political support of the ruling party. But we as Christians, though will be little discouraged from the present situation, we are not very much worried about it, for one reason that the church has always been minority and small, but at the same time exercising a very strong moral effect on the whole country through its various service systems in the field of education, healthcare, social development, and economic upliftment of the poor people in India. In that way, we are not very much disturbed, but we are little discouraged, I should acknowledge.
What do you think the biggest challenge to faith formation in India is today? What would you say?
One challenge could be, as I mentioned earlier, the faith formation activity and also socio-economical developmental activities taken by the church are termed by our Hindu fundamentalistic friends as attempt at conversion. The good that you do, in spite of being appreciated as a good for the development of the society, it is termed or it is looked upon as an attempt at conversion, and that is little discouraging, and that is also a concern for all of us. Otherwise, another concern for the faith formation is the rise of secularism. The traditional Catholic faith or the traditional practice of Catholic faith like Sunday Masses and so on is slightly on the decrease because of the rise of secularization and the secularistic mentality in the people and the secularistic way of trying to behave from the part of the youngsters. So that rising secularization could be seen as another. And a third concern is also, as I said earlier, a little discouragement from the part of the clergy and the religious, because they are not seen as encouraging people by the society at large, especially by the fundamentalists, but they are looked upon as agents of conversion, which is little discouraging and also a challenge to all of us who are in that field.
Well, Your Excellency, we thank you for filling us in on what it's like to be Catholic in India. Bishop Sebastianabin Singaroyan from the Diocese of Salem, India, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Coming up, an update on the probe into the discovery of 2,000 baby remains in the Midwest. And remembering longtime political journalist Cokie Roberts. As you heard earlier in the show, the White House, Vice President, and local lawmakers are calling for an investigation into the discovery of more than 2,000 baby remains at the home of an abortion doctor. Joining us now is State Senator Liz Brown, a Republican from Indiana, calling for a full investigation. Senator Brown, welcome to the show. Do we know anything more about Dr. Klopfer and how the baby remains wound up on his property?
No, we don't yet, but I'm hoping that both Illinois and Indiana will spearhead an investigation to figure that all out.
And I want to ask you about this. Reports say Dr. Klopfer did not have a license to perform abortions in Illinois since 1990. His license was suspended in your state in 2016. So how does something like this happen?
Right. Right. Well, we don't know if these are the remains of babies he aborted in the last many years when he was operating at his 3 clinics in Indiana and elsewhere. And his license was suspended and he refused to take any corrective action. And we had heard of stories about some of the horrors and how he performed them, not even under good health standards. But clearly there's a lot more to this story than now that we're finding these remains.
And this investigation is just beginning. But what are you hoping comes out of this?
Well, I'm hoping that we can have some insight into how this all happened. You know, these clinics refuse to have any sort of investigation in terms of health, meeting the simple health requirements at any other surgery center or anything like that. And so they have pushed back for years, the abortion center. And so I hope this will clarify exactly what needs to be done in the future if in fact an abortion clinic is open or continues to operate in Indiana or frankly anywhere, because some of the horror stories we've been hearing just since this happened is clearly they were not operating under sound medical conditions either.
And I think a lot of people now will start to make this comparison. I want to ask you, does this remind you at all of Kermit Gosnell, that infamous abortion doctor from Philadelphia? Oh, absolutely. And yesterday in our press conference, we had some heart-wrenching testimony from a young woman who'd been aborted at 13, had an abortion at 13. And her experience with Klopfer is very similar to how Gosnell operated. Mm-hmm. And pro-lifers are obviously shocked and upset. What can pro-life groups do now to prevent something like this from happening again? And for years, without people really knowing about it, the full details, what can pro-lifers do?
Well, I think you can look at Indiana. We've been at the forefront of some of these issues, and you can make sure anyone who purports to be a physician who is doing these abortions is actually going to make sure that they have to adhere to medical standards and that health departments can inspect. As I said, they refuse to let health department officials in there for years, and we need to make sure that we know what's going on inside there. And the pro-choice people and the pro-abortion people always push back on us from having those kinds of investigations. And if they clearly cared about women's health, they would want to make sure that the standards were up, and they're not. And that's clearly what we're seeing here.
And are you seeing bipartisan support as an investigation gets going? Are both parties behind this?
I would hope that we would. I think that we know that it's, at the very least, if those are remains from Indiana babies, that a crime has already been committed by the fact that they were transferred across state lines. So I would hope that both parties would come together to say that the laws of Indiana must be upheld. So I'll keep my fingers crossed.
Well, it's a story we'll undoubtedly keep following. Liz Brown, Republican State Senator from Indiana, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Legendary journalist Cokie Roberts has died. ABC News announced her death today. The 75-year-old, who was Catholic, worked for the network for decades covering U.S. and world politics. During her 40-year career, she also reported for NPR, CBS News, and PBS. Roberts passed away after a long battle with breast cancer. Her parents were both politicians. Her mother, Lindy Boggs, was U.S. ambassador to the Holy See from 1997 until 2001. Roberts is survived by her husband of 53 years, Stephen, 2 children, and several grandchildren. Up next, the leader of the largest archdiocese in the country talks about his upcoming meeting with Pope Francis. Plus, we're at a prayer service in New York before the United Nations General Assembly.
Se la compassione è il linguaggio di Dio, tante volte il linguaggio umano.
Pope Francis calls compassion the language of God. During his daily Mass at the Vatican, the Holy Father says being compassionate means becoming involved in the problems of others to try and help them. It must be used to combat the indifference of today's world, the Holy Father says. The leader of the largest archdiocese in the U.S. will talk tomorrow with Pope Francis about the role Hispanic Catholics are playing in the American Church.
They are totally committed to the life of society in the United States, making a contribution to every single aspect of life in the United States, and especially the values of the gospel.
Bishop Jose Gomez is one of the leaders of the Encuentro initiative focused on Hispanic and Latino ministry. The head of the United Nations wants to stop hate speech that leads to violence. Secretary General Antonio Guterres announces an initiative to do more to protect holy sites around the world. He joined an interfaith prayer service last night at a Catholic church in New York City. United Nations correspondent Sabrina Ferrisi reports.
The Holy See mission to the United Nations hosted a prayer service in New York on the eve of the 74th General Assembly. The annual tradition brings together men and women of different faiths working at the UN.
Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim.
Father Gerald Murray is the pastor of Holy Family Church, which is considered the UN's Catholic parish. He says God's grace is poured out on the hearts of those who come to this ceremony.
To come to the house of prayer, which the Catholic Church offers to this neighborhood, is a sign of goodwill for non-Catholics, and it's a sign of our openness and friendliness to have them pray with us.
Prayers were offered in 6 languages for world leaders, for an increase in peace, greater stewardship of the earth, and for refugees and migrants. There were also prayers for the elimination of nuclear arms and for those who suffer from poverty and disease.
It's obvious to everyone that hard work alone is not enough. That despite the best and the brightest coming to try to solve some of the intractable problems in the world, they hit walls. And so everybody's open to the help needed from above.
Father Roger Landry with the Holy See Mission says the Vatican will be speaking at the UN General Assembly on over 50 topics important to the Church. This year, they're also remembering the 25th anniversary of the attempt by the UN to make abortion a human right.
And the Holy See is obviously, with many other countries, going to be saying that there is no international right for abortion.
Bishop Paul Hinder was the keynote speaker. I asked him if there was religious persecution in his jurisdiction, which includes Oman, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. He says the UAE and Oman are remarkably tolerant to the Catholic faith. But it's a different situation in Yemen due to the war and resulting humanitarian crisis.
And of course, being Christians in that situation makes the things not easier. They are more exposed probably as others.
In New York, Sabrina Ferrisi, EWTN News Nightly.
President Trump is expected to speak at the UN General Assembly early next week along with other world leaders. Archbishop Bernardino Alza will represent the Holy See. Sabrina will bring us continuing coverage from New York. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Mark Irons. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.